Chapter 11 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Boggy Ford. That night we learned from Straw our location on the trail. We were far above the Indian reservation, and instead of having been astray, our foreman had held a due northward course, and we were probably as far on the trail as if we had followed the regular route. So in spite of all our good maxims, we had been borrowing trouble. We were never over 30 miles to the westward of what was then the new Western Cattle Trail. We concluded that the Running W herd had turned back, as Straw brought the report that some herd had recrossed the Red River the day before his arrival, giving for reasons the wet season and the danger of getting waterbound. About noon of the second day after leaving the North Fork of Red River, we crossed the Washita, a deep stream, the slippery banks of which gave every indication of a recent rise. We had no trouble in crossing either wagon or herd, it being hardly a check in our onward course. The abandonment of the regular trail the past 10 days had been a noticeable benefit to our herd, for the cattle had had an abundance of fresh country to graze over, as well as plenty of rest. But now that we were back on the trail, we gave them their freedom and frequently covered 20 miles a day until we reached the South Canadian, which proved to be the most elusive stream we had yet encountered. It also showed, like the Washita, every evidence of having been on a recent rampage. On our arrival, there was no volume of water to interfere, but it had a quicksand bottom that would bog a saddle blanket. Our foreman had been on ahead and examined the regular crossing, and when he returned, freely expressed his opinion that we would be unable to trail the herd across, but might hope to effect it by cutting it into small bunches. When we came, therefore, within 3 miles of the river, we turned off the trail to a nearby creek and thoroughly watered the herd. This was contrary to our practice, for we usually wanted the herd thirsty when reaching a large river. But any cow brute that halted in fording the Canadian that day was doomed to sink into quicksand, from which escape was doubtful. We held the wagon and saddle horses in the rear, and when we were half a mile away from the trail ford, cut off about 200 head of the leaders and started for the crossing, leaving only the horse wrangler and one man with the herd. On reaching the river, we gave them an extra push, and the cattle plunged into the muddy water. Before the cattle had advanced 50 feet, instinct earned them of the treacherous footing, and the leaders tried to turn back, but by that time we had the entire bunch in the water and were urging them forward. They had halted but a moment and begun milling, when several heavy steers sank. Then we gave way and allowed the rest to come back. We did not realize fully the treachery of this river until we saw that 20 cattle were caught in the merciless grip of the quicksand. They sank slowly to the level of their bodies, which gave sufficient resistance to support their weight, but they were hopelessly bogged. We allowed the free cattle to return to the herd, and immediately turned our attention to those that were bogged, some of whom were nearly submerged by water. We dispatched some of the boys to the wagon for our heavy corral ropes and a bundle of horse hobbles, and the remainder of us, stripped to the belt, waded out and surveyed the situation at close quarters. We were all experienced in handling bogged cattle, though this quicksand was the most deceptive that I at least had ever witnessed. The bottom of the river as we waded through it was solid under our feet, and as long as we kept moving it felt so, but the moment we stopped we sank as in a quagmire. The pull of this quicksand was so strong that 4 of us were unable to lift a steer's tail out once it was embedded in the sand, and when we had released the tail by burrowing around it to arm's length and freed it, it would sink of its own weight within a minute's time until it would have to be burrowed out again. To avoid this, we had to coil up the tails and tie them with a soft rope hobble. Fortunately, none of the cattle were over 40 feet from the bank, and when our heavy rope arrived, we divided into 2 gangs and began the work of rescue. We first took a heavy rope from the animals' horns to solid footing on the river bank, and tied to this 5 or 6 of our lariats. Meanwhile others rolled a steer over as far as possible and began burrowing with their hands down alongside a fore and hind leg simultaneously, until they could pass a small rope around the pastern above the hoof, or better yet, through the cloven in the hoof, when the leg could be readily lifted by 2 men. We could not stop burrowing, however, for a moment, or the space would fill and solidify. Once a leg was freed, we doubled it back short and securely tied it with a hobble, and when the fore and hind leg were thus secured, we turned the animal over on that side and released the other legs in a similar manner. Then we hastened out of the water and into our saddles, and wrapped the loose end of our ropes to the pommels, having already tied the lariats to the heavy corral rope from the animal's horns. When the word was given, we took a good swinging start, and unless something gave way, there was 1 steer less in that bog. After we had landed the animal high and dry on the bank, it was but a minute's work to free the rope and untie the hobbles. Then it was advisable to get into the saddle with little loss of time and give him a wide berth, for he generally arose angry and sullen. It was dark before we got the last of the bogged cattle out and retraced our way to camp from the first river on the trip that had turned us. But we were not the least discouraged, for we felt certain there was a ford that had a bottom somewhere within a few miles, and we could hunt it up on the morrow. The next one, however, we would try before we put the cattle in. There was no question that the treacherous condition of the river was due to the recent freshet, which had brought down new deposits of sediment, and had agitated the old, even to changing the channel of the river, so that it had not as yet had sufficient time to settle and solidify. The next morning after breakfast, Flood and 2 or 3 of the boys set out up the river, while an equal number of us started, under the leadership of The Rebel, down the river on a similar errand, to prospect for a crossing. Our party scouted for about 5 miles, and the only safe footing we could find was a swift, narrow channel between the bank and an island in the river, while beyond the island was a much wider channel, with water deep enough in several places to swim our saddle horses. The footing seemed quite secure to our horses, but the cattle were much heavier, and if an animal ever bogged in the river, there was enough water to drown him before help could be rendered. We stopped our horses a number of times, however, to try the footing, and in none of our experiments was there any indication of quicksand, so we counted the crossing safe. On return, we found the herd already in motion, headed up the river where our foreman had located a crossing. As it was then useless to make any mention of the island crossing which we had located, at least until a trial had been given to the upper ford, we said nothing. When we came within a half a mile of the new ford, we held up the herd and allowed them to graze, and brought up the remuda and crossed and recrossed them without bogging a single horse. Encouraged at this, we cut off about 100 head of heavy lead cattle and started for the ford. We had a good push on them when we struck the water, for there were 10 riders around them, and Flood was in the lead. We called to him several times that the cattle were bogging, but he never halted until he pulled out on the opposite bank, leaving 12 of the heaviest steers in the quicksand. "Well, in all my experience in trail work," said Flood, as he gazed back at the dozen animals struggling in the quicksand, "I never saw as deceptive a bottom in any river. We used to fear the Cimarron and Platte, but the old South Canadian is the gal that can lay it over them both. Still, there ain't any use crying over spilt milk. We haven't got men enough to hold 2 herds, so surround them, boys, and we'll recross them if we leave 24 more in the river. Take them back a good quarter, fellows, and bring them up on a run, and I'll take the lead when they strike the water, and give them no show to halt until they get across." As the little bunch of cattle had already grazed out nearly a quarter, we rounded them into a compact body and started for the river to recross them. The nearer we came to the river, the faster we went, till we struck the water. In several places where there were channels